Listen carefully. Because the first 8 seconds of this story contain a truth the Granger family spent 180 years trying to bury. In the spring of 1841, deep in the Alabama Black Belt, a young widow whispered a promise to one enslaved man under her control: one night, one reward, one act she believed would secure her empire. And within months, 17 men would be dead because of it. You weren't supposed to hear that, but now that you have, you're already inside the part of history polite society pretends never happened. Picture this. Dusk settling over Haven Plantation, the oak trees hanging low as if ashamed of what they'd seen. A storm was coming that night, but not the kind that rattles windows. This one was built from hunger, ambition, and a woman convinced she could bend human souls like wet branches. Constance Granger had inherited 2,000 acres of power soaked in cotton and cruelty, but she also inherited her husband's debts and the vultures waiting to pick apart what he left behind. She wore black silk for mourning, but the truth is, that silk wasn't mourning anything. It was preparing for war. And on that land, under her absolute authority, 63 enslaved people lived in a silence carved by fear. But among the 23 men working the fields that season, there was one she watched more closely than the rest. Not for his obedience, not for his strength alone, but for something darker, something she believed she could corrupt into loyalty. They called him Elias, broad-shouldered, quiet, with a stare that never broke even under the overseer's lash. A man who carried suffering the way some men carried pride. Constance believed men like Elias could be transformed not through violence alone, but through something far more manipulative, offering him a reward he could never refuse. A night not of affection, but of power. A night designed to bind him to her will. A night whispered not as intimacy, but as command. And while the plantation slept, and thunder rolled across the river, the widow set her plan in motion, one that would twist the hierarchy of Haven into something even more grotesque than slavery itself. Because when a woman with nothing left to lose dangles temptation inside a cage, every outcome becomes lethal. This is where the descent begins. The next morning, Haven looked unchanged to anyone passing by on horseback. The white columns gleamed. The veranda sat quiet. The river drifted by as though history moved only at its leisure. But beneath that surface, something in the air had shifted, an invisible tension, sharp as the scent of iron before lightning strikes. Constance Granger moved through the halls with a new stillness. Not a woman grieving, not a woman afraid. A strategist, a player who had just placed her first piece on the board. She understood a truth most people never dare admit. Power doesn't begin on the surface. It begins in the mind of the one who believes they deserve it. She believed she did. Her late husband had relied on overseers, quotas, predictable systems of brutality. Constance saw a flaw in all of it. She knew fear alone creates rebellion. She knew violence alone creates hopelessness. But a controlled offer, rare, intimate, completely unexpected, creates dependence. And dependence creates obedience deeper than chains. But the enslaved men didn't know her strategy. All they felt was confusion radiating through the quarters. Elias walked to the fields that morning silent, shoulders set, eyes unreadable. The other men sensed something had changed in him, though none could name it. A man can hide a bruise, hide a wound, even hide a lie, but he cannot hide when the world has put a new kind of weight on his back. Overseer Drummond noticed, too. He watched Elias from the porch of his cottage, suspicion tightening his jaw. He didn't know what the widow had done or promised, but he knew she had tampered with the fragile balance that kept the plantation functioning. He wrote later that it felt like chasing shadows around a fire that had not yet been lit. And still, the numbers rose. By the end of the first week, work output climbed by an impossible 11%. By the end of the second, 19%. It was as if the entire workforce had been pulled taut by an unseen force driven not by hope, but by a pressure they did not understand. Constance watched it happen from her balcony, fingers lightly tapping the rail, her expression neither pleased nor troubled, merely calculating. This was only the first stage. She had no intention of rewarding just one man. She intended to remake the hierarchy of Haven itself, and every man would be drawn, willingly or not, into the web she was spinning. And beneath the surface, the first cracks of catastrophe had already begun to form. Night fell differently over Haven as March unfolded thicker, heavier, as if the darkness itself had begun to listen. Every man in the quarters felt the pressure tightening like a rope pulled slowly, deliberately, by invisible hands. They didn't know what Constance Granger had done. They only knew she had changed the rules. And when rules change in a place built on brutality, men sense danger before they see it. Elias kept to himself. He spoke less, slept less. He moved through the fields with an efficiency that unsettled the others, not faster, not stronger, but focused, as if haunted by a private deadline. And when a man is carrying something he cannot speak aloud, others feel the silence like a cold wind in their lungs. Drummond watched him constantly. The overseer was no visionary, but he understood human breaking points. Elias was not breaking, he was transforming. That scared him more. Machines break. Men who transform can take entire systems down with them. One evening, Drummond confronted Constance in the office, brandishing the production ledgers like a warning. "You're pushing them too hard," he muttered, voice low. "Yield is up, yes, but something's wrong out there." Constance didn't look up from the ledger she was reviewing. "Wrong," she said, "is what happens when we do nothing. I am correcting the course." "You're playing with fire, ma'am." "Fire is the only thing that clears a field," she replied. There was nothing more to say. That week, Constance made a new announcement quietly, carefully, through whispers delivered by house servants. A reward would now be given monthly, bestowed upon whichever field hand exceeded expectations the most. She didn't specify the reward. That vagueness was intentional. It let the men imagine. And imagination is often more dangerous than truth. Some feared the unknown. Others hoped desperately. A few believed the rumors already spreading like smoke through the quarters that Elias had been the first to receive it. Constance didn't deny anything. She didn't confirm anything. She let the silence ferment. And in that silence, productivity surged again. But the human psyche can only sustain so much moral distortion before collapse begins. Resentment brewed. Envy sharpened. Exhaustion hollowed eyes and slowed footsteps. Something was coming, and every man felt it. Before we continue, I want you to descend deeper with me. Comment, I see the hidden architecture twice. Not for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you stop being a spectator and become an initiate. Now the descent continues. By April, the men no longer rose with the sun because they wanted to. They rose because the air itself felt watchful, because Haven had become a place where even hesitation carried a price no one could define but everyone feared. Constance Granger understood this perfectly. Fear is predictable. Pain is predictable. But ambiguity, that is the true architect of control. She walked the veranda each morning, her footsteps soft on the wood, her gaze drifting toward the fields with calculated indifference. She didn't need to bark orders or appear at the cotton rows. Her power worked from a distance, like a hand pressed lightly against a man's back, guiding him toward decisions he believes are his own. Elias had become the quiet center of the storm. Men watched him not out of admiration, but because they believed he knew something they didn't. Something that might save them, or doom them. He didn't correct them. He couldn't. The truth sat on him like a chain, and the weight of it changed the way he carried himself. In early May, a young field hand named Jonah collapsed. Not from sickness, he was strong, only 19, but from a pressure no body can sustain forever. Drummond ordered him back on his feet. Jonah couldn't stand. The overseer hesitated for the first time in years. That hesitation spread through the men like a spark. If Drummond was uncertain, then the ground beneath them was shifting. Constance heard about Jonah's collapse by noon. She didn't respond with punishment or anger. Instead, she walked to the quarters with a basket of food, a gesture so unprecedented it struck every man silent. She knelt beside Jonah, spoke to him quietly, then handed food to the others. A strange mercy, a weapon disguised as kindness. That night, the men whispered among themselves in the dark. Why would she do that? What does she want? If she can offer kindness, what will she ask in return? In places shaped by terror, a single act of softness can feel like a trap. Drummond didn't sleep at all. He sat at his desk, staring at the lamp flame flickering like a warning. "She's remaking the whole system," he wrote, "and I don't know what she'll sacrifice to finish the job." Under a moon dimmed by rolling clouds, Elias stood outside the quarters, staring toward the main house, as if he could feel the widow shaping his fate with every breath she took. He didn't choose this role. He was chosen for it, and the cost of being chosen had not yet revealed itself. The descent continues. By early summer, Haven Plantation had taken on a new rhythm, unnatural, accelerated, like a heartbeat forced to beat faster than the body beneath it. Every day began with a silence so tense it felt vaulted, like the world was waiting for something to break. And it would, because a system built on coercion can endure misery, it can endure cruelty, but it cannot endure uncertainty. And Constance Granger had engineered nothing but uncertainty. The men no longer raced against quotas. They raced against each other, against invisible expectations, against rumors, against their own unraveling minds. Every night, whispers curled through the quarters, threading through cracked boards and restless breath. "Elias knows something. She favors him. She's testing us. No, she's choosing her next one." None of these men had control over their own lives, but now they believed they had control over something else. The possibility of reward. Fear had been replaced by dangerous hope. And hope in the wrong hands is a lever. Drummond could feel the plantation sliding out from under him like soil eroding beneath a flood. He cornered Elias behind the carpentry shed one morning, gripping the man's arm with white-knuckled frustration. "What did she say to you?" the overseer demanded. Elias didn't answer, not out of defiance but because he couldn't. The truth wasn't a secret. It was a prison. "You listen to me?" Drummond hissed. "She's feeding you something that ain't food. You think you're rising? You think she picked you?" Elias stared at him with eyes emptied of certainty. Drummond stepped back, unsettled, because that look, the hollow, quiet confusion, revealed something terrifying. Whatever Constance had done, she had done it so completely that Elias himself could not name it anymore. That afternoon, the widow summoned Drummond. She poured tea as if conducting a social call, not a confrontation. "The men are producing," she said calmly. "Your objections are noted. They are also irrelevant." Drummond's jaw clenched. "They're turning on each other." "That," Constance replied, "is the price of motivation." She believed she was playing every piece on the board. But she had miscalculated one thing. Men under psychological siege eventually stop competing and start breaking. One night, as thunder rolled low across the Alabama sky, Jonah, the same boy she fed earlier, approached Elias with trembling hands and eyes full of dread. "They're saying I'm next," he whispered. And for the first time, Elias felt a cold truth settle in his chest. The widow wasn't rewarding excellence. She was rewarding influence. She wasn't choosing a man. She was choosing a message. And messages can destroy entire worlds. The descent deepens. June nights in the Alabama Black Belt carry a heat that feels personal, thick, pressing, almost sentient. At Haven, that heat mixed with something colder. The realization that no one understood the rules anymore. Not the enslaved men. Not the overseer. Not even Constance's closest confidants in the house. Because Constance Granger had stopped behaving like a plantation mistress and had begun behaving like an architect of outcomes. She didn't want obedience. She wanted transformation. That month, a strange ritual formed on the plantation, not something spoken, not something acknowledged, but something everyone felt. At dusk, as work ended, the men waited in a silent tension, wondering whether Constance would walk the veranda and who her gaze might rest upon. She never called a name. She never issued a command. She simply watched. And yet her watching alone changed everything. One evening, her eyes lingered on Jonah for half a second, barely noticeable. But half a second was enough. Panic rippled through the quarters that night like a disease. Jonah couldn't sleep. Elias couldn't sit still. Even the older men, who had long ago learned how to survive the whims of crueler masters, felt the old walls of their mental armor beginning to crack. Drummond tried to reassert control. He barked orders louder. He patrolled the quarters more aggressively. But control isn't rebuilt with noise. It's rebuilt with clarity, and clarity was the one thing Constance had removed from the world. Her influence was no longer physical. It was psychological. And psychological control is harder to resist than chains. That week, something happened that frightened the men more than punishment ever had. Output increased again. Not just through effort, but through desperation. These were not men working for survival anymore. They were working to avoid being seen. That's when Elias finally approached Constance voluntarily. Not to seek favor, not to seek reward, but to ask the only question a man destroyed by confusion will eventually ask. What do you want from us? She regarded him the way a mathematician might regard a difficult equation. Not with cruelty, but with fascination. What I want, she said softly, is order, not peace, not prosperity, not humanity, order. Elias felt the meaning pierce him then, because order built through pressure always ends the same way, with something breaking. And deep inside him, something already had. The descent is almost complete. By July, the plantation no longer felt like land, it felt like a pressure chamber. You could stand in the middle of Belle Haven's fields and sense the tension humming beneath the soil, an invisible current threading through every interaction, every order, every breath drawn under a sun that seemed angrier than ever. And at the center of it all stood a widow who believed she had mastered human nature. Constance Granger had achieved what no overseer before her had ever accomplished. She had turned survival itself into competition. She had made hope the leash. She had made ambiguity the weapon. She had turned men into instruments of her design, not through punishment, but through the slow erosion of certainty. But you cannot push the human mind past its limits without consequence. That consequence arrived quietly, on a night so still the cicadas themselves seemed to be holding their breath. Jonah disappeared. Not ran. Not taken. Disappeared. One moment he was in the quarters, shaking, whispering his fears into his hands. The next morning his pallet was empty, his clothes untouched, his tools stacked neatly in the corner. It was as if he had been wiped from the world. The quarters erupted with panic. Elias felt the men clustering around him, desperate for answers he didn't have, searching his face for signs of truth he could no longer offer. Drummond stormed through the yard demanding order, shouting threats he couldn't enforce, his authority crumbling with every unanswered question. And Constance stood on the veranda, watching the chaos ripple below her like a queen supervising a chess match 2 moves before checkmate. Elias approached her, fists clenched, chest heaving. "What did you do?" he demanded, not shouting, but trembling with a fury deeper than anger, helplessness. She answered with the coldest truth a manipulator can deliver. "I did nothing. They did this to themselves." And in a way she was right. Jonah had not vanished because of chains or punishment. He vanished because Constance had dismantled the very foundation of human endurance, the belief that tomorrow would resemble today. Elias felt something in him rupture. Not hope. Hope had died weeks ago. Not faith. Faith had no place here. What broke was the last thread tying him to the idea that resistance was futile. Because Jonah's disappearance didn't feel like an ending, felt like a warning. That night, Elias walked the length of the quarters again and again, staring at the dark horizon until one truth crystallized inside him, sharper than any blade. Whatever Constance had built, he would not survive it unless he tore it down. The descent reaches its final threshold. The night Jonah vanished marked the moment Belle Haven crossed a threshold it could never return from. The men felt it. Drummond felt it. Even the livestock grew restless, sensing the unseen fracture slicing through the plantation's foundation. Yet Constance Granger moved with a serenity that felt almost supernatural, like someone who believed the storm belonged to her. But storms have no loyalty. Elias spent 3 nights without sleep, haunted not by what he had seen, but by what he understood. The plantation no longer required chains or whips to maintain control. It operated on something deeper, something invisible, something engineered. Constance had built a psychological machine, one designed not to break men's bodies, but to reshape their reality. And Elias realized he had become its central gear. He didn't ask for this role. He didn't even fully understand it. But every man looked to him now, not because he was chosen, but because he was the only one who had survived the widow's influence long enough to see through it. On the fourth night after Jonah's disappearance, Elias walked to the main house, the moon slicing silver through the clouds. He didn't knock. He stood beneath the veranda, staring up at Constance as she appeared, calm as ever, framed by the columns like an icon carved in marble. "You've taken enough," Elias said quietly. Her head tilted. "I haven't taken anything. I revealed what was already inside them." Elias felt the full weight of her words, because that was her true power, not domination, not cruelty, but excavation. She dug into the deepest fears of human nature and let the men destroy themselves. "You can't control everything," Elias said. "I don't need to control everything," she answered. "Only the direction." And that was the moment Elias understood the plantation's final secret. Constance Granger didn't want authority. She wanted inevitability, a system so complete it could run without her, driven by the very people it consumed. But inevitability has one weakness. It only exists until someone refuses to play their assigned part. That night, Elias gathered the men in the quarters. No raised voice, no defiance. Only truth spoken with a clarity none of them had felt in months. "She wants order," he said. "Then we take back the only order that belongs to us, what we choose." And for the first time, the men didn't look at the house. They looked at one another. At dawn, Constance stepped outside expecting to see another day of silent obedience. What she found instead was absence. Not rebellion, not violence. Just the quiet power of men who had finally reclaimed the one choice she never calculated for. They were gone. Belle Haven's fields were empty. And the system she built, so precise, so manipulative, so absolute, collapsed in a single morning, undone not by force but by clarity. Because once a man sees the architecture of his oppression, he can no longer live inside it. The descent is complete. If the story shook something awake in you, subscribe. We're only scratching the surface of the forbidden architecture that shaped American power. Next week, we open another sealed chapter the textbooks refused to print.